In these laid-back days of summer, how many of you were expecting such an intense gospel this morning? In this week's episode of Mark, we are treated to a flashback, one that probably should have started with the warning, "This show contains violence and mature subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised." It seems that the scene opens harmlessly enough, I suppose. There's widespread wonderment about Jesus, this itinerant rabbi, doing deeds of liberation, preaching a radical message. Just who might he be? What's he all about? For some pondering the matter, however, the question isn't academic, nor is it simply a topic of idle speculation. Indeed, to the powers that be, it's a very serious question, one for which the possible answers seem downright threatening. Not the least among the concerned cohort is one Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee, answerable to the Emperor Tiberius. Most historians remember Herod as inept. In any case, Herod's assessment of the question at hand, while maybe a little dramatic, does make an intimate link between the missions, indeed the persons, of Jesus and John. And through Jesus and John, Mark will echo a truth the Old Testament prophets and prophets of recent generations too know so well. Agents of God who challenge those in power very often suffer significant consequences. So now the stage is set, and the screen goes wavy. And then as it returns to focus, we're looking in on an incident, a flashback, that happened not too long before when we were just situated. It's a lavish banquet hall. The who's who of Galilee and some very high officials and officers are present. Finest food and drink distinguish the festivity. And then a young girl, Herod's stepdaughter, offers a dance, one that immensely pleases the guests, particularly Herod himself. And whether he's acting the part of a big shot or simply carried away by the experience of the dance, he says to her, "Just name what you want. You can whatever you want, even up to half of my kingdom, it's yours." So the young lady goes to, "Mom, what should I ask for?" And Herodias, tired of John's nattering on as she sees it, says, "Ask for John the Baptist's head on a platter. Ask for it to come now." Now Herod feared John, we've been told. Knowing that he was a righteous and a holy man, he protected him even. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him, which is strange since much of John's prophetic critique was directed toward Herod, particularly because he had claimed for himself the wife of his brother. I don't know, maybe there was something in Herod that remembered God's word, some divinely sparked little flame that drew him to John's teaching. In the end, though, the question is moot. He had made a promise to Herodias' daughter that he would give her anything she wanted, never dreaming what she would ask. And though he was grieved at her request, his guests had heard an oath, his oath. The empire had replaced Torah for Herod, and that becomes more apparent with the gruesome end of his own birthday dinner. Now, I don't know how you see it, but it seems to me Herod's evil is more cowardly than it is vicious. But cowardice is a fatal flaw nonetheless. It puts self-protection first and blinds the coward to the wider long-term consequences of this focus on self-preservation. You can dress it up with names that normalize it, expediency, compromise, cutting losses. But acting out of fear usually does harm. I would venture to guess, just looking around at what we're all witnessing in this year of political and humanitarian disasters, that fear, not just the love of money, is the root of all evil. Fear of losing power or control, fear of losing supporters or allies, of exposure and humiliation. A few years back, the Washington Post quoted a lavishly paid lobbyist. There are only two engines that drive Washington, claimed the lobbyist. One is greed, the other is fear. That's a fine description of Herod's birthday banquet. Yet this posture of fear and self-protection is not limited to the corridors of power. If we're honest with ourselves, more than we care to admit, it runs up and down the hallways of our lives far too often as well. No wonder so many divine messages begin with, "Do not be afraid." Fear leads to death. Courage, which literally means an open heart, leads to life. Herod is unable to see the difference between real power and something that just poses as power as it flashes and flexes and presses its advantage. He continuously grasps for something he thinks will secure his hold on power, which he doesn't really have anyway. And Herod will chase it for the rest of his life, and it will finally hasten his ruin. So, this birthday banquet, it turns out, is a defining moment for Herod. The kingdom to which all human power arrangements must answer is emerging right in front of him. But he decides that saving face in front of his guests and officers and dysfunctional family is more important than saving John and leaning into whatever is afoot with the provocative Jesus. Yet listen, Herod's banquet is only the first of two banquets in Mark chapter 6. Herod's horrible banquet runs right into a story where Jesus makes sure that everyone is fed. The reel of this second meal is not displayed for us here this morning, but it does follow right after today's account, and both scenes in Mark are placed deliberately side by each. Jesus hosts the second meal. He hosts it in the middle of nowhere. He hosts it for thousands of nobodies with nothing to offer, save 5 loaves and 2 fish. And at this feast, greed and fear have no place. There, all are fed to the full, with leftovers beyond comprehension. Now, as I say, we didn't hear this story this morning, this second banquet, but I suspect most of you, if not all, remember at least something about Jesus feeding the 5,000. It's a story found in all 4 Gospels. Jesus withdraws to be alone, but a great crowd follows him. Though they're in a deserted place, that place ends up being a place of great abundance. The disciples, as the day moves on and they recognize folks are going to need to eat, says, "Send them away. We can't feed them." Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." "We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, they say. And yet, more than 5,000 ate, with 12 baskets left over. This banquet of life is a stark contrast to the grand affair that turns out to be Herod's banquet of death. The lavish palace, with its select guest of important officials, proves to be desolate. The deserted place, with its large crowd, turns out to be rich with abundance. At the end of his banquet, Herod sups on profound grief and guilt, while the head of John the Baptist is brought out on a platter as though it was the last course of the meal. Jesus' banquet ends very differently. 12 baskets of food left over, and a multitude of people satisfied with unexpected abundance. Preacher Barbara Lundblad once observed that, she said, "The leftovers of empire have almost always been destruction and death, even in the name of peace and security. There is always enough money for weapons," she said, "but never enough to feed those who are hungry." I'd be interested to know what the numbers are in Canada, but I recently read somewhere, I think, that if you took 13% of the military budget south of the border, you could feed the whole world. There's always enough money for weapons with empire, she says, but never enough to feed those who are hungry. But as she and many preachers regularly profess, I hope including this one, it's into such a world Jesus comes proclaiming, living, embodying an alternative vision. He called it the kingdom of God. And from the opening sequence of Mark's gospel, he announces over and over and over, the kingdom has come near. Our gospel passage this morning, do you realize it's one of the longest anecdotes in Mark's, it is the longest anecdote in Mark's gospel, actually. Mark, who's usually brief, goes on a fair bit with this one. And it's its only flashback. And other than the Golgotha plot and the discovery of the empty tomb, it's the only scene in which Jesus does not appear. And yet beneath this story of John is the story of Jesus. This flashback is also a flash forward. Herod foreshadows Pilate in the same way that John presages Jesus. The two prefects are nominally in charge. Both are amazed by circumstances surrounding an innocent prisoner. Both are swept up in events that quickly spin out of their control, finding themselves unable to back down after being publicly outmaneuvered. Unlike John, Jesus is passive in his final hours, and he faces with integrity his moment of truth. And he's executed by hideous capital punishment, dying to placate those he offends and to liberate those who receive what he offers. It's the cross and resurrection, friends, well early in Mark's gospel. Which brings us to a third banquet. Not just one shared in our readings today, or one only referenced in this sermon. It's one we will share this morning, as we do every Sunday. It too involves an oath, our oath, not offered in pompous pride, but rather in humble, courageous allegiance. It is offered to the one who gave himself for us on the cross and gives himself to us at this table. Through his death and our sharing in his death, through baptism and the ongoing Eucharistic life, we know the abundance of his risen life, and we become living embodiments of the gospel. Back in 1990, a creative Canadian cinematographer by the name of Denis Arcand produced an astounding satire called Jesus of Montreal. I don't know how many of you saw that. In the film, a despondent Catholic priest named Father Leclerc tries to put some pizzazz into a shrine's dreadfully dull production of the Passion Play. He recruits a promising young actor named Daniel, and he commissions him to develop a new script and to enlist a cast for a fresh production. Daniel needs the work, but he knows absolutely nothing about the gospel message. So he spends weeks in the library, absorbed in volumes about the historical Jesus. He is transfixed by what he discovers. Daniel contacts Constance, a single mother who's been sleeping with Father Leclerc, to play the role of Mary, the mother of Jesus. He chooses a beautiful friend named Muriel, an actress who plays in television ads, to render the part of Mary Magdalene. His buddy Martin agrees to leave his job dubbing for porno films long enough to play the part of a disciple. These actors are transformed by each performance. The story of Jesus touches them profoundly. Their electrifying production becomes the talk of Montreal. Daniel becomes more Christ-like in his behavior. However, his adaptation of the gospel text discloses the sham of much contemporary church and society. So diocesan and public officials order that the proclamation be closed on Holy Week. In an act of civil disobedience, Daniel and his crew present one last performance. When a security guard tries to halt the production during the crucifixion scene, a patron pushes the guard. The resulting scuffle topples the cross, and Daniel's head slams into the stone, and he dies. Daniel has no relatives, so his actor friends give his body parts to the medical center. The movie ends with scenes from the operating rooms, a woman receiving sight through a cornea transplant, a man receiving Daniel's heart, another patient saved by an organ transplant. Meanwhile, none of the actors return to their old professions. They enter the streets of Montreal, living embodiments of the gospel story, the story displayed so profoundly in the crucified Daniel. It would seem that, though we may not have realized it at the start of our proclamation of the word today, today is a tale of 3 banquets, and within each is a choice. Herod chose loyalty to empire and self-concern. He presided over a banquet of death. Jesus turned and still turns his disciples toward a hungry world, even when it seems there's just enough to feed ourselves and no more. So this Eucharist, this Eucharistic banquet, is a defining moment for us. Week by week, Christ beckons us beyond ourselves to enter into this drama and be transformed, to become living embodiments of the gospel. If we come to this table choosing his kingdom above all else, when that happens, there will be a rich banquet of life for everyone.